Hey y'all. I'm going to actually try to read to you the conclusion of this book by Jean-Pierre Dupuy from 2023, The War That Must Not Occur. I'm going to start with the epigram to the appendix, which is a quote from René Girard, who is the founder of mimetic theory. His last book in 2010, Battling to the End, is what's quoted here. I think this is and I think Dupuy bears this out, that all of the best thinking about how do we actually achieve world peace is going to be built upon the foundation that Girard founds in this book, particularly Battling to the End, which was his reconsideration of Clausewitz and being able to see post-Clausewitz, post-Napoleon, the new era into which we've entered is indeed apocalyptic. And so picking up Girard here, he says, humanity is more than ever the author of its own fall because it has become able to destroy its world. With respect to Christianity, this is not just an ordinary moral condemnation, but an unavoidable anthropological observation. Therefore, we have to wake up to our sleeping consciousness. Seeking to comfort is always to contribute to the worst. In other words, if we believe this fun and flattering lie that because the worst is now possible that it won't happen, that is the height of hubris and a huge mistake. And this whole book, and for the first 100 pages of this book, Dupuy basically summarizes, as he says, over 10,000 pages of the history of strategic thinking about nuclear war. And then he kind of comes to this summary that I'm going to try to read for you now. This is an immensely difficult book that deserves a close reading, not only once but twice. I've thought numerously of the quote from Karl Kraus, who said that if you're not going to read my book twice, don't even bother reading it once. I don't want to be misunderstood. So if you're going to read it 3 times, fine. But if you're only going to read it once, don't bother to read it. And it's like C.S. Lewis says, you don't know a really good book at all if you've read it only once. And so I'm kind of going back through it again here for like the 3rd time. And I realize that I really do need to put together a full-on presentation of this. I think it's that important. Because at one point I say, hey, wow, he actually figured it out. That we need to use the escalation to the extremes, picking up on one of Girard's insights, is that the escalation to the extremes by rational men, they realize it and they step back from the brink. And so the escalation of the extremes actually does have a coordinating, deterring effect. Kind of like a guy who knows he's got an anger problem. When he feels that anger, like the Incredible Hulk, when he feels that anger growing, he looks for avoidance strategies or deterrence strategies. And I think that really is the real genius of mimetic theory, is that it realizes that there is this natural escalation of the extremes. There's this iron chain of logic which starts unraveling, and it's very difficult to stop this escalation of extremes. But one of the main ways to do it is to be aware of it. And I think this is kind of where we're headed here. But there are lots of things that occur despite their a priori probability of being nil. In other words, it's almost impossible for you to win the lottery, but someone does. Okay. And so with that in mind, let's talk about how we're led by successive stages of increasing ethical exigency to state the question posed by Daniel Ellsberg in his book, The Doomsday Machine, in connection with the nuclear deterrence, parenthetically. This is Ellsberg's question. At what level of risk must we consider the risk to be intolerable? At what point do we have to act? More precisely, by placing it in the conception of time, that holds the future to be necessary. At once, one runs up against the paradox of self-stultification, which we have studied in some detail. If it is required that the escalation to the extremes that a nuclear war, limited to begin with, is bound to generate never occurs, then the nuclear war must be made impossible. But if it is impossible, then it has no deterrent effect since it has no reality. Resorting like Bernard Brodie to the metaphor of destiny, one averts the prospect of catastrophe by regarding it as fated. But if it is averted, then plainly it was not fated after all. The cataclysmic future that one succeeds in preventing cannot be a necessary future since it does not occur. Thus one is naturally led to introduce a vanishingly small epsilon, not as the possibility of nuclear war, but in a superposition with the success of deterrence. And this is the epsilon is the possibility of nuclear war. And he's saying that when you do this, you got to do it in superposition, not necessarily with the possibility, but rather with the success that it is deterred. The epsilon makes it possible then to get around the obstacle of successful deterrence that is self-stultifying by making the escalation to extremes a part of the future, thereby allowing this escalation to have a deterrent effect, but at the price of making it possible also that the deterrence will fail. Stephen Lee, Violence and Conflict with Itself. Stephen P. Lee, whose 1996 book identified the many paradoxes I have tried to resolve in the present chapter, published no less a remarkable article 8 years later titled, What's Living and What's Dead in Nuclear Ethics? Not the least of the merits of the argument he advances is that it turns inside out what most military strategists and academic theorists take for granted, that MAD, this aggravated form of nuclear deterrence that bears the name of its failure, mutually assured destruction, this is what most military strategists and economic theorists take for granted, that it is a thing of the past, that MAD is a thing of the past, a barbarity that would be best forgotten. Lee maintains, quite to the contrary, that with the advent of the atomic bomb, humanity lost its innocence, and we are now forever more caught in the toils of the moral paradox embodied by MAD. Nothing will deliver us from it, neither the course of geopolitics nor the development of new technologies, whether these bear upon offensive weapons or launch vehicles or anti-missile systems, not even a denuclearization of the world. MAD has not always existed, of course. It was brought into the world during the Cold War. We have examined the difficult circumstances of its birth, but now it hovers over us like a platonic form or the grotesque and baleful images of the Japanese pop artist Takashi Murakami, evoking Hiroshima, and it will be with us so long as we have not blown up this planet. When Lee's article was published in 2004, the Soviet Union was no more, and Russia was no longer the enemy of the United States, which now appeared to be the sole superpower. What difference did that make to the global nuclear situation from the moral point of view? It may be worth recalling once more that to begin with, MAD was neither a doctrine nor a strategy. It was a military state of affairs in which each of the rival nuclear powers had the capacity to destroy the other's society, even after a crippling first strike, since this did not nullify the capacity of either one to respond. The power of nuclear weapons by itself made such a situation possible for the first time in human history. The very power renders all attempts at defense futile, and any thought of preemptive attack rendered mad. This very power renders all attempts at defense futile, and any thought of a preemptive attack mad. There remains only deterrence. That Russia and the United States were no longer enemies is a purely contingent fact. The proof is that this ceased to be the case on February 24, 2022, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. MAD is capable of assuming another strategic configuration at any moment. It is this abiding possibility of mutually assured destruction and not its incarnation in a particular historical circumstance that poses the moral paradox. It is the abiding possibility of mutually assured destruction and not its incarnation in a particularly historical circumstance that poses the moral paradox. This paradox, it will be recalled, places ethics in contradiction with itself. On one hand, deterrence appears to be the only means of avoiding a nuclear war and mutual destruction. Consequentialism, therefore, not only approves it, but considers it to be a moral obligation. On the other hand, deterrence rests on threats, whether they are expressed in words or conveyed by the weapons themselves, existential deterrence, which, if they were to be transformed in actions, would constitute a supreme evil. Both the doctrine of just war and deontological ethics, however, are concerned with intentions, no less than actions. The tensions between these two attitudes is an ineliminable fact of our nuclear condition, whether the direst consequences come to pass or remain merely potential. There are two ways in which a particular incarnation of MAD could be ended. On one hand, an agreement not to settle differences by armed conflict, though this could not be expected to last indefinitely. On the other hand, the abolition of nuclear weapons, though this, according to Lee, at least, and this question is much disputed, would have the effect only of relocating the moral paradox. Nuclear weapons can be gotten rid of, but the means of making them cannot be unlearned. In a situation of global zero, which is to say the complete elimination of nuclear weapons, every nation threatens his enemies with rearming before they do. From this, as we saw earlier, there results what Jonathan Schell calls a regime of weaponless deterrence. If, in fact, as Lee claims to show, this regime is less stable than that of armed deterrence, consequentialism would insist on the latter. Deontology, however, would insist on the former. Global denuclearization would therefore do nothing to dispel this moral paradox. I have said more than once that MAD is an aggravated version of nuclear deterrence. I should say exactly why I believe this to be so. When competition takes the form of a game of chicken, which is to say a zero-sum game played by two nations at the edge of abyss, where little is at stake by comparison with the plunge of humanity into the downward spiral of global destruction, there is nonetheless something that the adversaries find worth their while to contest. Influence over a region, possession of a territory, the prestige that comes from conquest, and so on. It is therefore because they want the same thing that the rivals risk toppling over into the abyss. But it is also because they still find reasons to quarrel that they do not fall into it so easily. The situation under MAD is completely different, however. There is no longer anything for the rivals to contest. MAD is the ultimate stage of violence, where the only thing that matters is protecting oneself against the lethal blows of the other. But how does one protect oneself? By recourse to the very same violence. Earlier, drawing on the anthropology of violence and the sacred developed by René Girard, I proposed a solution to the prudential paradox that relies on his great insight, namely that human violence is capable of self-regulation and self-transcendence. Violence is able to put itself outside of itself in the form of the principal institutions of society. Among them, religion, government, the economy, and war. And in this way, to hold oneself in check. There is no better framework for thinking about the ultimate stage of violence represented by MAD, in which violence is concerned with nothing but itself. But from this anthropological perspective, I believe it becomes possible to understand Lee's claim that we will not be able to deliver ourselves from the curse of mutually assured destruction, finding extreme violence both our only means of protection, the consequentialist argument, and the reason for our condemnation. Nothing can justify killing hundreds of millions of people or forming the intention to do so, not even our willingness to shift responsibility for this unspeakable objective onto mechanisms we have voluntarily given up power to control. As a philosopher working in the analytic tradition, Lee was not interested in investigating the anthropological dimension of the problem and restricted his attention to the moral paradox. But here again, it seems to me that he did not go far enough, having failed to resolve the prudential paradox. My aim in these concluding pages is to fill this gap. In order to do that, it will be necessary to come back to rational metaphysics, the very discipline that made it possible to propose a new solution to the vexed problem of accounting for the effectiveness and rationality of nuclear deterrence. Recall the preliminary conclusion we arrived at earlier in this chapter. What has allowed nuclear deterrence to work until now, and may allow it to go on working, is the indeterminacy of the future in a conception of time that makes the future necessary. I have inevitably been led by the nature of my approach to think of this indeterminacy in terms of a superposition of states. As long as the future has not been actualized, it must be conceived as including both the catastrophic event and its non-occurrence, not as disjunctive possibilities, but as conjunction of states, which one or the other will prove a posteriori